of the fact that these ballots that came in, some of them came in much late, but because they were actually not required to be stamped because they were already paid for, they were postage paid envelopes, nobody knows how many of these ballots actually were voted on during the correct time. We don't know if some of them were collected at mailboxes and people sent them in. As a matter of fact, a very significant number of them now are being challenged because the signatures on the ballot don't match the signatures on the original forms. We, at this point, do not know who won the Democratic primary in the 12th Congressional District in New York. Oh, let's use another one. I wrote a commentary recently in the third largest city in the state of New Jersey, Paterson, New Jersey. We still do not know who won in the city council race because there were 16,000 ballots turned in and only 13,000 of those ballots were considered to be appropriate. And so you are now looking at cases in New York and New Jersey, not to mention all the others that we could cite, which if you now extrapolate for the entire country, you can see that this hand waving, there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud, is illustrated to be false simply by the various stories in the news, which one would hope that the Associated Press actually covered. But nevertheless, the article goes on to say Trump has increasingly sought to cast doubt on November's election and the expected surge in mail-in and absentee voting as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. And of course, again, we have, when you have mail-in balloting, no chain of custody. We don't know if that was you who filled out the ballot and mailed it in, or somebody did it for you, or somebody found your ballot and pretended to be you, or even if you filled it out, there wasn't somebody looking over your shoulder to determine whether or not you voted correctly. And then we have what's called ballot harvesting, where individuals then take those ballots and drop them off, and you don't know if when you see somebody voting in a way you don't want them to, you threw those in the garbage and did not turn those in. You have so much potential for fraud. It is absolutely unbelievable. And while I will at least begrudgingly admit that what is said here in the Associated Press is probably true, the states that have had mail-in balloting may have at least some better safeguards than others. But when you have the governor of the state of California saying, we're going to mail a ballot out to every registered voter, you know we have already had the experiences of some of these ballots just showing up in mailboxes, and as a result, people collecting those, and then they can pretend to be the person who actually has the ballot, and maybe they can fake the signature, maybe they don't care, maybe people don't even check for the signature. And when we've had people actually go back and evaluate some of these ballots, you can see the difficulty that Donald Trump was talking about. So nevertheless, the whole question is, will Donald Trump win re-election? And of course, if he does not, he will certainly cite this issue of mail-in balloting, and that sort of gives him an excuse to say he was cheated out of that election. I probably learned that a little bit from Hillary Clinton last time. But there are some that are saying it may not necessarily matter because there is an argument being made right now by Leonard Toporoff that Trump's second term is virtually assured. And I'm thinking, really? Looking at all these polls, how can he say that? But I'll just use one of his arguments. He says that, first of all, we have polls that on the one hand say that Donald Trump has a 54% approval rating on the economy, and yet 70% disapprove of his handling on the virus. Okay. And those seem to be contradictory, and instead cites a different poll, which is the Rasmussen poll, which I think is much more accurate in trying to discern who is going to be an actual voter, which has Donald Trump at 48% approval and trending up, and believing that that could translate into 300 electoral college votes, and that Donald Trump will have the coattails to even turn the House of Representatives as a Republican House. Which, again, I don't know what this guy is smoking, but, you know, it might be something we want to pass around because he's about the most optimistic person I see. And on the other hand, he does point out that Joe Biden does have a few problems. putting sentences together. Now the question about the evidence of how he leaked false information about General Flynn, the fact that they're now in Ukraine, a prosecutor digging into potential criminal liability, at least of his son. And so maybe there's some evidence that indeed it might not necessarily be that close an election. I have my doubts, but nevertheless, once you hear both sides, and for nothing else, Donald Trump, I can't believe you put out that tweet. And after this is all over, maybe we'll read a book someday where we find out that the vice president came in and said, Mr. President, of all the tweets, that one makes the least amount of sense, and we didn't need controversy right now, and you created it all by yourself. Anyway, let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover now about the pandemic, the things we were going to talk about before Herman Cain died and before Donald Trump issued his tweet. We'll talk about that right after this.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
This we can talk about the pandemic and the coronavirus. And again, for those of you that watch online every once in a while, I do put up a graph, and we may need to do more of that in the future. But if you're looking at this sheet and happen to be looking here, you can see that the daily number of tests have gone up and up and up. And I remember when people were saying we would eventually like to have almost 1 million tests a day. We're getting pretty close to that, and it has been, I think, a testimony to the entrepreneurial activity and the work of various medical facilities that they've been able to do that. And yet the fallback position for people sometimes has been, well, the reason we have more cases because we have more tests. And again, is it possible that if Louis Gohmert hadn't been actually tested after he was in that hearing, he would even know that he has the virus? Maybe, maybe not. And he was tested in part because he was supposed to come with the president to Texas, and I guess is not going to be doing that right now. But if you look at this graph, you can see that the cases are going up not just because of the test, but a better way to look at it is to look at the other two graphs here to recognize that when we were talking about hospitalizations, we were able to drop those down precipitously, and now we're back up where we were before. So anybody that says, oh, these are funny numbers, or they're counting people in hospitals that don't have COVID, you know, there's probably a little of that. Always there are those anecdotal stories, but that is certainly something to be concerned about. And when we look at, again, the daily deaths, you know, you can see that that's dropped down, and it's gone all the way up to now 1,400. Matter of fact, here's a good question for you. How many minutes in a day? Well, it's pretty simple. 60 minutes every hour. 60 times 24, 1,440, 1,440. That's exactly how many people die every day. A person in America dies every single minute from COVID-19. Now, one of those we just talked about was Herman Cain. But get that in your head for just a minute. Every single minute, another person in America dies of this disease. So when people try to minimize it, say it's not that big a deal, that there's a lot of hyperbole here and all the rest, I would acknowledge that sometimes people have miscounted. Sometimes some of these figures may be overinflated, but we are working with numbers right now, assuming that these are generally correct, and everybody knows that there are probably some mistakes on one side or the other. But again, 1,400 people die every single day, one person every minute. And that, I think, illustrates, again, the extent of COVID-19, which now brings me to the next piece I want to cover, and that is the Centers for Disease Control Director, who is Robert Redfield, testified yesterday that suicides and drug overdoses have surpassed the death rate for COVID-19. So I just talked about an individual dying every minute from this disease. And yet those numbers are small when you look at some of the other numbers for suicides and drug overdoses. Now, to be fair, we've had so many drug overdoses just from opiate overdoses that every year as many people die as the number of people that died in the Vietnam War. If you've ever gone to Washington, D.C. and ever seen the wall and all those names of all the people that died in Vietnam and recognize more than those individuals every single year die of drug overdoses, we recognize that, first of all, if you will, the baseline was pretty high, but it's gotten much worse, as you might imagine. I've done some commentaries here on the whole issue of the number of drug overdose deaths has skyrocketed, and there are all sorts of explanations for why that is the case. Everything from the fact that the supply chain for drugs has been affected, so some of those individuals may have gone instead to synthetic drugs, which might be more lethal. And the second one, even more sad, because of the lockdowns, a lot of people probably taking drugs by themselves, and if they have an overdose, there's nobody there to call 911. So if you start looking at some of these numbers here, a lot of people said, well, we're not quite sure where Robert Redfield got his numbers. Well, it turns out there's a doctor at the John Muir Medical Center in Walnut Creek, California. Since I grew up around that area, I know exactly where that was. And he said that they've already seen a year's worth of suicide attempts just in the last 4 weeks. So in 4 weeks, they've had as many suicide attempts as they normally see in an entire year. So that gives you some idea as well. According to the American Medical Association, more than 35 states have reported increases in opioid-related mortality, as well as ongoing concerns for those with mental illness or substance use disorder in counties and other areas within the state. And then this list goes on and on and on, just to simply document all of this as very good evidence of the fact that while we're dealing with this pandemic, there are some other ancillary and collateral issues that need to be addressed. What I thought for just a minute before we take a break is to address an issue that has been front and center over the last couple of days. And if you're not familiar, there was a press conference, which we mentioned yesterday, and it was one that was put together by a member of Congress. And it had a number of doctors all wearing white coats. Just because they're wearing white coats doesn't mean they're doctors, but apparently they all indeed have medical credentials. And they actually presented evidence for a number of things, for the value of hydroxychloroquine, I'm always have trouble, hydroxychloroquine, as well as arguments for opening the schools. And Adam Mill, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, said, social media, if it wants to play doctor, they should be prepared to be sued for malpractice. Because he said most people understand the constitutional guarantee of free speech does not include falsely yelling fire in a crowded theater. A panicked mob can crush or trample weak and vulnerable people as the instinct to survive overtakes common decency. And he said this came to mind when Breitbart announced that Twitter and Facebook censored a press conference by actual doctors describing their life-saving lessons learned from treating actual COVID-19 patients. Among the lessons discovered was the prophylactic use of the combination of hydroxychloroquine and other inexpensive therapies that seemed to stop the disease from advancing to its deadly second phase. One doctor, who by now has been ridiculed by, including the former Vice President Joe Biden, as a crazy woman. Okay. But by the way, she's from Africa, I think Nigerian. So she's a true African American, okay? But that's okay. We can make fun of her, apparently, because we disagree with her statements in which she said that vulnerable patients that she's had with diabetes, heart conditions, advanced age, she announced that she has not lost a single patient with the early intervention of this therapy. Additionally, she also pointed out that her staff who have been taking this as a prophylactic, not one of them has actually come down with COVID-19 either. Now, the argument that it was made to censor all this was Facebook actually justifies censoring these doctors because they said, quote, "We've removed this video for sharing false information about cures and treatments of COVID-19. And shortly thereafter, YouTube and Twitter also removed those because they violated their COVID-19 policies. And Adam Mill points out by censoring doctors, they're offering their own medical opinion to the public that these cures won't work and suggesting that it's dangerous to let patients and other doctors hear the advice. And his point is, are these censoring decisions being reviewed and approved by actual physicians? Because they're tantamount to playing doctor in the public. If what these doctors say is true, then it's conceivable that patients who could have been saved by this advice will die. And if what these doctors say isn't true, then the correct response is a rebuttal from properly licensed physicians relying on the latest and best science, not censorship. Indeed, Twitter expressly told Breitbart that the site's entire account would be limited because the video may pose a risk to people's health, including content that goes directly against the guidance from authoritative sources of global and local public health information. So not only is Twitter, which is not a medical provider, claiming that these actual doctors are wrong, Twitter is actually saying that patients that follow this advice could be at greater health risk. And so again, the question he asks is, a doctor who did this could be sued for malpractice, So why should these social media giants be immune from the same consequences? I think it's a good question. So when we come back from the break, you might say, well, I think these people were actually spreading misinformation, so the social media experts were wise in doing that. And so I just want to at least quote from a very prominent epidemiologist at Yale University who's now making the case not only is this treatment effective, but he is accusing Dr. Anthony Fauci of running a misinformation campaign against hydroxychloroquine. Of course, Louis Gohmert said he was going to be using it as well. And one of the articles we've posted here is called Pandemic versus Protesters. Star Parker gets into the conversation of one that we sort of have, and that is, who do I believe after a while? One minute we're told that you can't leave your house, and then we're told that the protesters, they're safe. There's no concern that they will get COVID-19. And after a while, you start wondering, who do I trust and who do I believe? And apparently the answer is just trust the social media outlets. Even though they're not doctors, they know what is medically appropriate and inappropriate. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View.
your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, and again, I'm not going to get into all the issue of hydroxychloroquine. As a matter of fact, some people say, well, it can cause heart damage. And I have a Facebook friend who had used hydroxychloroquine to treat malaria because of a trip or a few that he was taking to Africa, and then later said he had heart damage. Now, was that due to it? I don't know. I'm not going to get into the medical issues there, but are there potential dangers? Of course. But one of the things that is being surfaced in some of this conversation is that people with very good credentials are saying that there seems to be a real bias against hydroxychloroquine for one very good reason. It was promoted by the president, and that's reason enough. Now, again, don't take my word for it. Dr. Harvey Reich is with Yale University. He's an epidemiologist at Yale's Molecular Cancer Epidemiology Laboratory. Okay. He is an individual that has been arguing that there may be a misinformation campaign coming from Dr. Anthony Fauci. I'm not going to get into who said what or who said anything else, but he says, look, we can really begin to look at the effectiveness of this particular treatment. And the response almost always from Dr. Fauci is this is anecdotal. Of course it is. And that gets into something which I don't want to get too much in the deep weeds, but the argument is being made that we don't really necessarily have a randomized controlled trial of this. In other words, the so-called gold standard, a double-blind study. Now, I was thinking about this even as I was reading this article and thinking, I'm not sure we have a double-blind study right now on the vaccines, which they want to put in your body. Because during a pandemic, I just think it would be almost immoral to not try to go in that direction. Because in a typical study, I will give certain patients an actual treatment, pill, whatever it might be, an injection, and the others will just get a saline solution or a placebo. But at a time when people are dying of a pandemic, I can't even mentally justify giving some people a placebo. So a lot of this is anecdotal. Got it. But let's just recognize a lot of what is going to be not only a treatment, and again, hydroxychloroquine and remdesivir and things like that, those are basically treatments. And then those which would actually be vaccines, none of them are really going through that I know of. And maybe I'm incorrect on that. But if nothing else, what you're seeing is Dr. Reich, who, again, is a professor of epidemiology. He's the director, I might even add, of the Yale's Molecular Cancer Epidemiology Laboratory. No small individual there, who even recently in an interview actually said that this hydroxychloroquine is the key to defeating COVID-19, claiming its use particularly when administered with 2 antibiotics, and we can talk about what those are in just a minute because that's what our friend Louis Gohmert's taking right now, along with nutritional supplementary zinc, he says has been shown to be highly effective. And he recognizes that we don't have the gold standard right now of clinical research experiments, but the reality is we don't have the ability, nor would it, I think, even make sense to do it right now in that regard. And so, again, he points out the fact that this can actually prevent the progression of the disease, where you put hydroxychloroquine with zinc, azithromycin, and doxycycline, and it has been proven, according to him, to reduce the need for hospitalization and reduce the mortality or morbidity. So that's what we've got. Now, whether you believe it or not, that's exactly what Representative Louis Gohmert is going through right now. He says he's going to take hydroxychloroquine to treat his coronavirus infection. He said he and his doctor are all in on that, so he's going to be taking erythromycin, hydroxychloroquine, and zinc. And that's what he's doing right now to actually address this particular infection that he has. Before we run out of time, let me mention, while we're getting into this whole idea of the pandemic, Star Parker, and we've posted this article for you as well, has pointed out that a lot of us are really perplexed. And he said we shouldn't be ashamed about the fact that we are perplexed, because she says, on the one hand, in the name of health and safety, we've been asked by the government to compromise personal freedoms that we've always taken for granted. Going to work, going to church, sending our children off to school, meeting our friends in our favorite restaurant. But she says, instead, we then look around, we see we see chaos, basically, no uniformity at all, because then protests, she points out, often violent, are sweeping our cities. The same public officials who tell us to keep our kids at home, who tell us not to pray in church, as we have always prayed, or to limit our places of work and livelihood, look the other way, often with approval, and I love the word here, as hooligans tear apart our cities. Greater demands from government should meet increased respect for the law, but we're seeing just the opposite. Government making more demands while disrespect for the law increases across the nation. So then she quotes from one of the decisions we mentioned last week from this church in Nevada, because Justice Samuel Alito pointed out in his dissension that for months now, states and their subdivisions have responded to the pandemic by imposing unprecedented restrictions on personal liberty, including free exercise of religion. Now 4 months have passed since the original declaration. The problem is no longer one of exigency, but one of considered yet discriminatory treatment of places of worship. He went on to say that Calvary Chapel has been brought to our attention because there's evidence that the governor has favored certain speakers over others. When large groups of protesters openly violate provisions of the directive, such as the rule against groups of more than 50 people, the governor not only declined to enforce the directive, but public supported and even participated in a protest. And so, you've seen some of the situations in which, in some respects, they were arguing that a particular casino in Nevada has more rights than a church in Nevada. Of course, we've seen the same thing unfolding there in California. And so a little bit later, Star Parker points out some of the other issues, because while we've been focusing on the pandemic, we haven't been focusing sometimes on the protesters and the rioters. And she says going hand in hand with the rioting and violence is a nationwide surge in crime. The Wall Street Journal reports increases in homicides in Milwaukee, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and Kansas City. At the same time, she says there is violence and damage among protesters in Seattle, Portland, and Louisville. And if nothing else, she says, amidst the chaos, citizens need to take control of our own lives. We have a civic duty to do it, and it will help the nation and its recovery. So again, just a couple of points that I wanted to cover here in the last hour here that we have before the national hour. And so if you find yourself saying, I'd like to read a few of those, maybe even pass them on to friends, neighbors, coworkers, post them on my Facebook post or maybe my Twitter feed. We've provided those on the website, pointofview.net. My commentary today is on news media newspeak. And that is, you might remember from 1984, there were all sorts of sort of newspeak ideas being presented. Freedom is slavery, war is peace, ignorance is strength. And now we've seen just a whole redefinition of freedom, a whole redefinition of what violence is, largely peaceful when we have violence taking place in the streets. And so, if nothing else, quite a bit of evidence of the fact that words no longer mean what they used to mean because they've all been redefined. And so if you want to read my commentary on that, it is available also at our website, pointofview.net. We come back from the break. Megan Marshman will be with us. We'll talk about her book for a little while, Meant for Good, The Adventure of Trusting God in His Plans for You. And I think you will appreciate the conversation briefly as we get into some of that will hopefully help you in your Christian growth based on Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. We'll be back right after this.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and I'm so grateful that you have decided to join us today. Over the next couple of hours, going to cover a number of things. First of all, a new book coming out next week, Meant for Good. I think you will really appreciate that conversation we'll have for a short period of time, and then we'll get into some of the issues in the news, lamenting the death today that was announced of Herman Cain, a Republican presidential candidate, an individual that has been an articulate voice for many of these conservative ideas that sometimes are in the news. By the way, the John Lewis funeral just coming to the end here. So we talk about another African American. So we'll get into that in the next part of this hour. CDC director says there are now more suicides than overdoses than the COVID deaths. Given the fact that we have 150,000 people that have died of COVID-19, one person dies every minute, I might just point out. These are just staggering numbers, so we'll get into some of that. And then, given the decision by the social media to close down a press conference by doctors, I love what Adam Mills says. If social media wants to play doctor, they should be prepared to be sued for medical malpractice. So we'll get into some of those issues later this hour. Then the next hour, we'll also be talking about this new book coming out called Sanctified Sexuality. Gary Barnes will be with us in studio, and we'll be doing probably a numerous interviews on that particular topic for a variety of reasons, simply because it's almost a who's who of people that have contributed to that book and addressing many of the issues we talk about so often here on Point of View. No doubt you're familiar with Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. And no doubt you may even have a poster or a plaque on your wall that has that. But we're going to talk about the significance of that particular verse and how we can derive some great ideas about hope and involvement in our own lives as we talk with Megan Marshman. She is the author of this book, Meant for Good, published by Zondervan, coming out next week, a teaching pastor at Willow Creek Community Church, leads the women's ministry at Arbor Road Church, and also serves as the director of women's ministries at Hume Lake Christian Camp there in California. And Megan, it's just great to have you with us today here on Point of View.
Oh, I'm honored to be a part of the conversation because it's an exciting one, especially in these days.
One of the things that you start off with, I'd never thought about this, teaching a class without opening my mouth, which is just the craziest. It's called the vow of silence, but you were teaching, and every once in a while at 8 o'clock class, and those of us that have either had to teach 8 o'clock classes or attend them, you know that no one is quite awake. And so you came up with this idea. What did you do last weekend? And a young man said, well, I decided to take a vow of silence. You ought to try it sometime. And you did. Tell us the rest of the story.
Oh, it's so good. Basically, usually you get some bland answers. I just try to wake a class up at 8 a.m. And he just talks about the weekend where he was silent. And imagine, I mean, even in today's culture, can you imagine taking a vow such as that one? And then he turned in kind of a snarky moment, getting the class to laugh, says, you should try it. I mouthed, okay. Didn't say it, just mouthed it, because that was just a future of what the rest of the class would be. Sat quietly, disappointed all of my students because they expected to have the plans for them in a neat and tidy PowerPoint lecture articulated perfectly and in an inspiring and memorable way, and suddenly all they had was the truth in front of them. And what I got to experience was one of the most effective classes when I took the expectation off of myself and put the discovery of learning into the hands of the students who were hungry for it but had not been given the opportunity, at least by me, throughout the semester, and watched them dive into the textbook for themselves, watched some stand at the front of the class and fumble their way through trying to go through my own lecture notes. But what I realized is it's not just true in our classrooms. It could be true of ourselves, that God may not give us the plans he has for us in a neat and tidy PowerPoint lecture, but if only we would step up to the plate and dive into the textbook he's given to us, we may trust him more in the process and arrive at loving learning again and knowing truth and then knowing how to find it for our own life. So again, I'm so grateful that you're willing to take the risk. And then I love where you say, I thought we were going to be talking about Jeremiah 29:11. and yes, we are, but that was the first part. And what I love about your book, 12 different chapters in 4 different parts in which you take each part. For I know the plans, one part. I have for you, another part. And so in some respects, you kind of give us the breakdown of something that I know even in our own house, we have a picture of that on the wall. But as Steve Miller, who is our engineer, I'm sorry, he's not, or our producer, not here with us this week because he was on vacation, always likes to point out verses like Jeremiah 29:11 and 2 Chronicles and some of these others are sort of wrenched out of context. So you actually take some time to get us back into the life of the weeping prophet Jeremiah to understand what that really meant in that particular passage of Scripture, right? Yes, absolutely. We went on a dive deep, and that was the fun part for me, is going on that deep, wanting to understand these truths. And while they were written to different people at a different time, they were still written for us. But I will even say that sentence brings such truth to me, that the Bible was not always written to me, but for me. And the difference even between those two phrases begins to shift, especially certain genres that are written in Scripture. So going on this journey and then recognizing, but what are the timeless truths that we can pull out? Truths like God does know the plans. And then sitting there for a bit might change what we do toward the God who knows the plans, especially if the verse doesn't continue on by saying, and I'm planning on telling them to you. I feel like we have all these expectations of what it means that God knows the plans, that he's going to perfectly align them, perfectly bring them for our comfort. And then we find ourselves disappointed again. And the beauty is there are timeless truths we can pull from this passage, too, by the way, which was written to a people who were in the season of waiting and not knowing the future. Sounds familiar? I think we can resonate with this passage more than ever before, but we need to know how to read it well. And then the beauty is to read on past verse 11, where God does give us specific ways that we can respond to the fact that he knows the plans. He goes into it, verse 12, then you will call upon me. And that is a direct contrast to calling upon yourselves. And I fear too many of us are feeling all the weight of the world on us to call upon ourselves, to pick ourselves up by our bootstraps. And we find ourselves exhausted again. Then you will call upon me, God says, and come and pray to me. I hear that invitation from God to us here today. Lean in. The relationship is there. He's moving toward us. The question is, how are we going to respond? Are we going to try to figure out the plans, or trust that he has them and trust that his plans are meant for good? One of the things I've been doing in my Sunday school class is actually saying, what can some of these Old Testament prophets say to our circumstance right now with the pandemic and the protests and everything? We've done Obadiah, but right now I happen to be in Jeremiah, so it fits very well. But let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about, first of all, the value of the book, but also for those of you that maybe are pastors or Sunday school leaders or small group leaders, there's a study guide, there's a DVD, there's a streaming access, and a number of other things. So in addition to the 12 chapters, there are also 6 sessions that you can use in teaching this as we focus on some of the lessons we can learn from the weeping prophet Jeremiah. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
If you've ever read George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984, you are familiar with the idea of newspeak. Examples would be war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. But if you look at the news media today, you would probably conclude that Orwell accurately predicted the future, but was just off by about 36 years. Gerald Baker believes that the news media has become fluent in newspeak. He acknowledges that we don't have a ministry of truth here in America, but that doesn't mean that newspeak isn't alive and well in the news coverage we receive. Consider the term freedom. Yes, we're told that free speech does exist on college campuses, but it is so narrowly defined as to not really be free speech at all. He refers to a letter circulated at Princeton University requiring all research and publications be submitted for approval to a special committee in order to root out anything that might be considered a racist thought. How about the term violence? According to most of the mainstream media, smashing a statue or assaulting a police officer does not constitute violence if done by a progressive protester. One example he supplies is a BBC tweet that actually said 27 police officers injured during largely peaceful anti-racism protest. By contrast, we have the example of Senator Tom Cotton, who wrote an op-ed for the New York Times that suggested that U.S. military could be used when violent protests have overwhelmed police and the National Guard. Staff at the New York Times were furious that his op-ed was printed and argued that his writing was actually a form of violence that must be prohibited from the newspaper. We live in a world where words like freedom, violence, and racism have been redefined, so be on the lookout for newspeak. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for just a few more minutes, Megan Marshman, and I just might mention that this book's coming out next week, but wanted to give you kind of an advanced look, and if you would like to know a little bit more. First of all, it's published by Zondervan. You probably can find it in your local bookstore, but if you wanted to pre-order it, we have a link there as well. Also have a link to her website where you can pre-order it, so there are all sorts of great resources so you can connect up with her. Perhaps you'd even like to have her come and speak to your group. So again, this is a book which I think you would want to know more about. Meant for Good, The Adventure of Trusting God and His Plans for You. And I thought we might just pick out one example. Not enough is enough, and that is the plans I have for you. There is a sense which sometimes we do have this not enoughness because whether it's Madison Avenue or our own fleshly desires, we sometimes aren't necessarily learning to be content in whatever circumstance we find ourselves in. And so, Megan, that's one of the things that you address there in the book, isn't it?
Absolutely. We address a lot of the lies that we find ourselves believing in our heads. And then one of the biggest ahas that was learned was this phrase, I'm not enough, seems to be on the forefront of someone's mind and oftentimes even reaches the mouth and our lips of what we speak about ourselves, about those around us. And here was the surprise truth was that I wonder if I'm not enough for everyone all the time is not the lie we believe. The lie is that we believe we have to be enough for everyone all of the time, which would not lead us to a place of dependence upon our Heavenly Father, but rather to a place of calling upon ourselves yet again. I fear we put far too much on ourselves. We forget our greatest lifeline of all, and we're carrying some lies in our head and then thinking that some truths are lies, when in fact the truth is we're not enough, and that's enough for God to use us in magnificent ways because it allows us to partner with Him in the plans that He has.
One of the themes that really runs through your book is the idea of trust and belief versus anxiety. You know, we've always memorized verses like Philippians 4:6, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. Or even in 1 Peter, we have, cast all your anxieties on Him because He cares for you. Jeremiah finds himself in a situation, of course, this Sunday I'm teaching on Jeremiah 32, so that's when the Babylonians are at the gate and all that. But even back there, the forces are coming and the uncertainty is there. And in some respects, I know you no doubt wrote this book before you knew we were going to have a pandemic, before you knew we were going to have riots and everything. But in some respects, as this book landed on my desk, I thought, you didn't write it for this time, but it's even more appropriate for this time with all the anxiety in the air, don't you think?
Oh, man, I could not have no one could have predicted, right? I was journaling about that just this morning, sitting quietly. Yet, I'm smiling because of course, God knows the plans, and of course He would put this. How crazy. I'm writing a book on the fact that we can't know the plans, but we can trust God who knows the plans in a time where I had plenty of plans. I smile at that fact and laugh, and it only goes to further the point that God knows the plans, and while He's not planning on telling them to us, He does invite us to do something, and that's why we can't stop at verse 11. We have to keep going, and we have to. And it's beautiful because what Jeremiah is doing right throughout the entire book, 170 times, he says, declares the Lord, declares the Lord. Clearly, Jeremiah was listening to the right voice. He knew how to hear from God 170 times, yet he was speaking to a group of people who were listening to the wrong voice, right? Jeremiah 28, we meet Hananiah, who falsely predicts that things are going to get better and easier with God and fast, and you won't be in the hard. And yet we find throughout the entire book that God doesn't remove us from hard things, but He does want to transform us through them, which gives us purpose even to our pain in the present circumstance.
Well, and again, I love that 171. There was another one in there in your book where you talked about Jesus asked 307 questions himself, and he was asked 183 questions. And a lot of the questions right now, Megan, that we're asking are, what's the future? Are we ever going to get back to normal? In just a minute, I want to promote you as a speaker and for an individual to maybe even take some of the material that you have. But when is this going to all end? And so in some respects, there are just more questions surrounding us than ever before, aren't there?
Yes. Oh, I love that stat. I think it can bring comfort for anyone who's listening in, who's ever been afraid of not knowing the answers. So like you just mentioned, Jesus was asked over 300 questions. By the way, he asked over 300 questions. He was asked 184. Of the 184 he was asked, he only answered 3 directly. How frustrating.
Yes.
Until you realize the beauty of the one who knew the answer to every single question was less interested in giving the answers and far more interested in relationship. And I think it's still true today. Who he was is who he is and who will be tomorrow. The one who does know the answer to all of our questions is very interested in relationship. And so I wonder, just to lead with all of our questions, I wonder where we're bringing all of them. Are we bringing them to the internet for Google searches? Are we bringing them to Alexa and Siri? Or are we bringing them to the one who knows the answer, yet wants to be in relationship with us, to allow us to know how to go about these questions that we have?
Let's, if we can, talk about where people can find out more about the book. First of all, of course, we have information about it where people can get it in paperback or Kindle, but we also are encouraging people to go to our website, pointofview.net, and they can go directly to meganfate.com, either way, and there they can find some of these resources and speak to that, because we have a lot of individuals that are maybe saying this would be a really good book for us to cover, maybe in a small group study, maybe in a teaching time, maybe a Bible fellowship, maybe even a pastor might say, I might want to preach this from the pulpit. And so in addition to the fact that it's a 200-page book, 12 chapters, there's also a 6-session study. There's a study guide, there's DVDs, and as they go to your website, they can find out more about you. They can join your prayer team. They might even eventually, once we get out of lockdown, schedule you to come and speak. So talk about some of the resources that are available both on your website and associated with this book.
Yeah, let me give a reason even behind those additional resources. I'm of the belief that if I merely speak for 45 minutes, let's say, best case scenario is an audience understands. But if at some point I asked a question and someone in the audience raised their hand and said something, they would remember it because they would either critique it or be very proud of what they just said, right, for the rest of it. So if you say something, you remember it. If you discover something, you own it. And you only are going to act on what you own, not necessarily what you agree with. So we wrote the book because there's this content people have to know. You have to know what to do in response to the fact that you don't know the plans, but God invites you to actively trust him and not just say what you do, but to take steps of faith, and that's what the book aligns. But the reason behind all the other additional resources, these group studies, is to get people talking because then they'll remember it. And then to take them on a journey of discovery, because when you discover these truths for yourself, you own these truths. And then you have the potential to act on what you own and not just agree with someone else's opinion, because I think what our world needs is a little less opinion and a lot more truth. And so we might as well let the truth shape our opinion.
Yes. And again, sections on Not Enough is Enough, Tuesdays with Jesus, Don't Stop Dreaming, Who Before What, The Man Without a Home, Lord Teach Us to Pray. Just a few great illustrations of what is in this book. And really the way you've put this together is it can be a source of individual study for anybody that would like to work their way through it. But I do sense that as a teacher, you've really tried to craft it in such a way with various verses and questions and those kinds of things so that it really could be kind of a self-study or a group study. And if they get the study guide and this book, I think they got everything they need, don't they?
Indeed. In fact, that's what I love is we have Jeremiah. Of course, we have his words prophetically spoken to a people in the midst of a waiting. But what we have also is the rest of the Bible. So the fun part of this journey was breaking down these 4 verses, Jeremiah 29, 11, 12, 13, 14, and breaking down each portion of it, but then running to other portions of Scripture to see what this truth looks like lived out in the New Testament, what it looks lived out in a letter from Paul. It's this beautiful journey of not just agreeing with all that the Bible says, but moving and living in light of it. And then you find yourself like words like hope, living in light of hope and allowing the biblical definition to trump any other definition we hold. Too often we use the word hope as this flimsy word. Oh, I hope this happens. I hope things get back to normal. Yet our hope biblically is secure. And that is a direct contrast to anxiety. If you're longing for security, you can find the truth. And that's why I wrote the book.
Very good. Hope, believe, trust, and again, just a biblical look at truth about the fact that you can trust God's plans in your life, even if you may not know what some of those plans are. So, Megan, appreciate your conversation. Thank you for writing the book and look forward to seeing it in the bookstores next week.
Absolutely. And thank you for asking good questions. You look a lot like Jesus. You asked a lot.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into some of the issues in the news. We have a lot to cover. And then Gary Barnes will be in studio with us as we talk about sanctified sexuality in the next hour. All that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Point-of-view/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Had a number of things I wanted to talk about, but front and center came, of course, when it was announced today that the former Republican presidential candidate Herman Cain, talk show host and CEO of a pizza outfit and other activities, to mention just a few, actually has died. And I think we'll probably hear a lot about that, if for no other reason than the fact that he was at that Tulsa event with Donald Trump, and he was seen there as not wearing a mask. And so in some respects, there were many people that were saying, we didn't really hear a lot of press coverage if we were supposed to get such a big spike after that Tulsa rally. Well, we're going to hear about it now because of Herman Cain. And so again, while we're talking about him as an African-American, of course, the John Lewis funeral was today. But here is an individual that Herman Cain was the CEO of a major pizza chain. He was a supporter of Donald Trump, but also was a Republican candidate, and probably best known, as we've oftentimes said, for 999. And that is the 999 plan was 9% tax on personal income, 9% tax on corporate income, 9% national sales tax, and it had simplicity for sure. His argument was if 10% is good enough for God, 9% ought to be good enough for the federal government. And I thought it was kind of interesting that when Senator Mitt Romney wrote a piece today, he said, saddened that Herman Cain, a formidable champion of business, politics, and policy, has lost his battle with COVID. St. Peter will soon hear 999, keep up the fight, my friend. And if you remember, he was running against Mitt Romney back in 2011. And in some respects, that's where you had this just really interesting kind of phenomenon. It was sort of the flavor of the month club, if you will. And that is that first, I think it was Michelle Bachmann did very well. And then all of a sudden, as a long shot candidate, he won a straw poll in Florida in September and began to be, for a short time, kind of an attractive candidate as an alternative to Governor Mitt Romney, or now Senator Mitt Romney. But nevertheless, that faded pretty quickly for a variety of different reasons. And so, if nothing else, Herman Cain no longer living, and an individual that most likely would be an situation that we will probably get back to in the future. So we'll talk about that. Let's talk about the pandemic for just a minute. And that is, first of all, let's just recognize that for people that have not been paying attention, we now once again have one death every single minute. And I've shown some of these graphs here before. I guess I could grab them again and hold them up there if you have not seen them. Some of you like to watch online, and so I can show you that here, if you look at the daily tests, those have increased. And a lot of times people say, well, the reason we have an increase in the number of cases is the increase in the number of tests. Well, part of that is true, but a lot of it is not. Here's the daily cases going up. But the ones that you really want to pay attention to are certainly the current hospitalizations, which were at a peak there in April, dropped way down, and now up there again. And then, of course, the daily deaths, which were up here. But again, we are again at 1,400 deaths a day. Again, one every minute. 60 minutes times 24 hours, 1,440. So we are now, every single minute you're listening to this program, another person dies. And of course, one of those is Herman Cain. So it illustrates again how extensive some of this is. But then one of the articles I've posted is even more, if you will, eye-opening, because you have the Centers for Disease Control Director, Robert Redfield, who testified that suicides and drug overdoses have even surpassed the death rate for COVID-19. He argued that lockdowns and the lack of public schooling in some respects have had such a negative impact on, of course, young people's mental health. And, of course, let's recognize, as I've talked about in previous commentaries, that the number of just opioid drug overdoses and drug deaths have exceeded anything that we might have seen in the past. For example, in the past, they exceeded the number of people that have died each year. The number of people died each year of COVID. Let me get it back. The number of people that died of opioid drug overdoses has exceeded the number of people that died in Vietnam. And if you've ever looked at or gone to Washington, D.C. and saw the wall with all those names, it just helps you understand that, first of all, with these drug overdoses and these drug deaths, they've been so high, but that has been exceeded rather dramatically. Some people said, well, they don't know where the data came from, but this particular article I've posted here has a doctor from John Muir Medical Center in Walnut Creek, California, not far from where I grew up, where the facility has seen a year's worth of suicide attempts in the last 4 weeks. So just think about the number of suicide attempts during an entire year. They've seen that many in 4 weeks. Or again, this article here from the American Medical Association, quote, more than 35 states have reported increases in opioid-related mortality, as well as ongoing concerns for those with a mental health or substance use disorder in counties and other areas within the state. So this is certainly a source of some concern, and one of the reasons why we posted some of these articles for you to consider. Let me take some phones in just a minute, but real quickly, I thought I'd take on one other issue, and that is some of you have asked, what about the decision by the social media to actually pull the press conference that was held by a number of doctors? And I love this piece by Adam Mill because it says if social media wants to play doctor, they should prepare to be sued for medical malpractice. And he first of all starts out with recognizing that free speech is not completely free. We recognize that you cannot falsely yell fire in a crowded theater. People might get crushed or trampled or those kinds of things. And he said, I thought about this when Breitbart announced the other day that Twitter and Facebook censored a press conference by doctors describing their life-saving lessons learned from treating COVID-19 patients. And he said some of the lessons being discovered were whether or not the particular combination with hydroxychloroquine with a number of other elements, which I'll talk about in just a minute, could be helpful. And one of those doctors, who is apparently from Africa, African-American by definition, actually, announced that she had not lost a single patient through the early intervention of this therapy. And matter of fact, used as a prophylactic for the various members of her staff. Another doctor talked about opening the schools, something we've talked about on this program before. Another one talked about the health effects of the lockdowns. But back to the key point, the censorship that was taking place first began with Facebook, then very quickly YouTube and Twitter followed suit because the argument was that it violated the COVID-19 policies. And I think what Adam Mills says is by censoring doctors, they're offering their own medical opinion to the public that these cures don't work and suggesting that it's dangerous to let patients or either other doctors hear about some of this. And so the question that he asks, which I think is a reasonable question, are these censorship decisions being reviewed and approved by actual physicians? Because they're tantamount, he says, to playing doctor in the public. If what these doctors say is true, then it's conceivable that patients who could have been saved by this advice will die. If what these doctors say isn't true, then the correct response is a rebuttal from properly licensed physicians relying on the latest and best science. And if nothing else, what Twitter actually said was that they were concerned that the video may pose a risk to people's health, including content that goes directly against the guidance from authoritative sources of global and local public health information. So he makes the case. So not only is Twitter not a medical provider claiming that these actual doctors are wrong, it's actually saying that these patients following this advice could be at greater health risk. And so you put this in perspective when you have, for example, one of these individuals who is at Yale University. Matter of fact, he's a professor of epidemiology and director of Yale's Molecular Cancer Epidemiology Laboratory. And he has argued that in some respects, using hydroxychloroquine, as well as supplemental zinc and 2 different antibiotics. He says it's been shown to be highly effective and argues that Dr. Fauci sometimes seems to be running almost what he says is a misinformation campaign against hydroxychloroquine. Sometimes we don't even know who to believe. But if nothing else, I thought it was kind of striking to see that when this goes against what we think is possible information, we're going to shut it down. And in some respects, we're going to hear a lot more about whether or not hydroxychloroquine, along with some of these antibiotics, is effective or is not. But let's take a break. We'll take some phone calls right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to California first. David, what's on your mind?
Well, hi, Kerby. I think yesterday we reached our 56th person in San Francisco to die of COVID, so a moment of silence for them. But you know what's amazing about this whole epidemic is it's actually a kind of a delicate virus. It's apparently it's got like this fatty coating on a mineral, and if the mineral's fatty coating breaks apart, then the whole thing falls apart, and it will fall apart in like 3 days. A lot of this discussion about stuff, if you don't wipe off your counter every 3 days, Well, apparently this thing is delicate enough that just average air will kind of break apart this fatty coating around the virus.
Sure. And one of the reasons of washing your hands in soap, that will break down the fatty coating too. But go ahead. Thank you.
Right. Well, and you're right. And in fact, you don't need Lysol or bleach or all that. Just average soap will do the trick. And so, the idea that we could have, before it became, 2% contagion or 10% contagion, what do they say in Florida is now 30% of the state is infected? And that is just deadly. I mean, that means the state is almost a write-off, that they've got so much contagion down there. And the only thing you got to do is stay at home, read a bunch of good books for about 2 weeks, and not be running around spreading this. It just needs to be settled down. And the idea that everybody wants to get back to work, and they're talking about taking away the stimulus, taking away eviction protection. In an epidemic, you want people to be able to go home and settle down.
And keep them.
And then they get evicted, they're all of a sudden on the street and spreading it. So, the way I believe that Trump is a phony in this is he doesn't know what exponential growth is.
Yeah,
he knows.
One of the things I've talked about is most people don't. We're so used to arithmetic growth, we don't know what exponential growth is.
But he's a TV guy, right? And he knows that exponential growth knows when you go from 2% to 12%, and all of a sudden the eyeball's watching you on TV. So he knows what exponential growth, but he pretends that the epidemic isn't exponential growth.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the comments, and that just, again, underscores one of these real concerns that people have had about the fact that everybody wants to go back to normal. And I just keep saying, even our own church wants to get together this week, which they will. And I said, what's the difference between March 2nd and August 2nd? There are a whole lot more people that are infected August 2nd than ever were in March 2nd. And back to what David was saying, everybody wants to get back to normal. Well, that's not working, and I just showed you some graphs and charts. Again, for those of you that happen to be watching online, just look at those numbers. You see this dip and then this increase, and you see it in hospitalizations, you see it in deaths and other things. Just a sad commentary. But let me real quickly, before I run out of time here, mention a couple of others. First of all, I did mention this epidemiologist at Yale who has been arguing that Dr. Fauci really only says what we have for this issue of hydroxychloroquine is anecdotal. Well, that's true, because we don't have the kind of what we call gold standard test, which are those where you have kind of a double-blind study and all the rest. But I don't know that you can even do some of those during a pandemic. And when you have individuals that are actually saying that we can mix together hydroxychloroquine with zinc and erythromycin, that seems to be the case. And just the other day, we heard that Representative Louis Gohmert's been on this program before. He tested positive, and so he says that he is going to be taking hydroxychloroquine along with erythromycin and zinc, and he and his doctor are in, and so we'll see where that plays out as well. But I wanted to cover one other article that I posted because some of you have been asking. Yesterday, you might remember, we talked about some of the problem with online learning, and Mark Bauerlein points out that the biggest limitation is that we have been training students for literally their lives to use a computer screen to actually play video games, share photos, watch shows, check Instagram, send text messages, order food, get directions to send tweets. And now we want them to all of a sudden use that to read, study, and watch educational films. And that's not working very well. And as he says in his piece, Mark Bauerlein, who's been on the program with us before, it's years of a certain behavioral conditioning at the screen. It makes it difficult for students to treat, I should say, the screen primarily as an instrument of learning, not as an instrument of diversion, and teachers don't have the time or the power or the knowledge to recondition them. So I gave you some suggestions yesterday, and I may put this in a commentary about if indeed you're students are going to be learning online, at least have them, if they have a writing assignment, write it out in longhand. Have them read books on printed pages, not online. When they watch instructional videos, ask them to take notes, and just a number of real practical suggestions. But that led to a question that many of you ask, and we now have an answer. How much will this remote education actually cost? Because what we find here is that a very significant number of the nation's 15 largest school systems, as well as thousands of others, have defaulted to a full-time remote learning. And so this particular amount of research was done by the people at the American Enterprise Institute. And when they did so, they began with the baseline numbers. And the baseline numbers are the average cost per school per pupil is about $13,600 a year. It goes back a few years, but it's probably pretty close. So we'll just use $13,000 a year, and that's for a 5-day-a-week, 180-day in-person experience. So that's what it costs for us to put a student in the chair, for us to have teachers and administrators and all the resources necessary. So then in the article, which you can get online, we have it here at Point of View, we look at the cost of live instruction. Then you look at the cost of instructional resources. Then you look at building maintenance, because after all, even though those buildings are empty, you still have to have some kind of maintenance for them. And then you have computer and internet access. So at the end, they said, so what does remote schooling cost? And they said on a per pupil basis, we've got a price tag of about $3,200 for live instruction, assuming schools triple their actual performance from the spring. And then they have some additional things for instructional resources, building maintenance, meals, computers, connectivity, and then just put in some incidental costs. So you still end up with about $5,229. So $5,200. So the bottom line is simply this. If a nation normally spends $13,000 per pupil, right now the public schools will be delivering about 38 cents of education for every dollar in the outlays. And so if you want to raise that with maybe your elected representatives, your school board, and others, simply say, it does seem to me that we need a rebate. Maybe we need to reduce the cost for property tax or a variety of other things, because for a fraction of the cost, their estimates are 38 cents on the dollar for remote education compared to what we do in student, in classroom education. I thought you would like to see that article, because many of you have been asking that question. And now we have a pretty good answer from the American Enterprise Institute. We come back, we're going to spend some time talking about Sanctified Sexuality, a new book coming out, and we'll be talking about that right after these important messages.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me this hour. We're going to spend some time focusing our time and attention on this very important new book called Sanctified Sexuality, Valuing Sex in an Oversexed World. And it is a book coming out in a couple of months, and you might say, why are we talking about it now? Well, one of the advantages of talking about it right now is to cover so many of the chapters in the book, because there are actually 23 different chapters in the book, and there's a real need for us to maybe have a chance to chat with a couple of individuals who have actually been involved in writing it. The book is, in a sense, edited by Dr. Sandra Glahn, who's been in studio with us before, and Dr. Gary Barnes, who is in studio with me today. The book is coming out. We have information about that, so you can pre-order it. But Dr. Barnes is an ordained minister and a licensed psychologist, really specializing in the area of marriage and family counseling and the rest. Has his bachelor's degree from Cornell University, his master's degree from Mankato State University, a THM from Dallas Theological Seminary, as well as numerous degrees, all the way up to a PhD from Columbia University. After graduating from Dallas Theological Seminary, was an assistant pastor for 7 years in the New York area, and is an individual now that has actually focused a lot of time and attention on this very important issue of sanctified sexuality. So, Dr. Gary Barnes, just great to have you in studio.
Hi, Kerby. Thanks so much for letting us be with you.
I might just mention that, again, we are talking about 23 different chapters on topics ranging from almost all the things we talk about on this program, from adolescent sexuality and gender issues and gender dysphoria, homosexuality, same-sex attraction, cohabitation, infertility, divorce, rape. You just go down the list of all the things that we're going to talk about. And when you have this many topics and this many professors, Dr. Gary Barnes, I got to ask you, how did you pull this together? I can't get 3 or 4 professors to agree on anything, and you've got a veritable who's who of some of the best and the brightest writing on all these issues. So this must have been a little bit of herding cats.
I will say we paid quite a cost, but we're very, very pleased with the people who did come together in this shared effort. And, they all shared a common vision. That part made it easy.
Yes.
And the shared common vision was, we need to really have a good voice from many different expert contributors that can elevate sexuality.
Yes.
Because we're struggling in this area.
And there's really
understandably so.
For sure. And let me just say, as I did yesterday when I was announcing that we were going to have you on, that we'll give you a parental advisory. Today we're going to probably talk more about divorce and a little bit about sex ethics. So it's not going to be like when we've gotten into issues like pornography, but you never know. So I just thought I'd give that advice to individuals. And in some respects, when I was reading the introduction by you and Sandra, there was actually a course called Sexual Ethics. And so in some respects, this is an opportunity to take some of the things that have been in the news to try to teach them in a seminary context, but then help everybody else, pastors, laymen, and others, understand how to really kind of think through some of these very contentious issues, right?
Yes, and so it kind of, as many things, had a unfolding story to it.
Yes.
At the very beginning, before we had our course on sexual ethics, Dr. Glahn and I were just chatting in the faculty lounge one day. And, following kind of a series of national things where it kind of got people stirred up, we found that there were a lot of really good people and well-intentioned people who were creating negative impacts with their good intentions. And a lot of these were people in ministry and people in the name of Christ even. And we said, we as a training institution and as seminary professors, we probably could be doing something more to help this.
Yes.
And so that actually became the launching pad for creating a course in sexual ethics to try to help us understand from a more informed position, both from God's revealed truth from Scripture and the authority of Scripture, but also from God's discovered truth from good, solid research, and bringing these together in all of God's truth approach to a course on sexual ethics.
And really, in some respects, I feel sorry for seminary students today, because I've said this before when I've been a visiting lecturer at various seminaries, including Dallas Seminary, that you think back to the 1940s or 50s, you think of John Walvoord or Louis Sperry Chafer. They didn't have to think about artificial insemination. They didn't have to think about the issue of homosexuality except on the periphery. They didn't really have to think that much about cohabitation, and certainly weren't thinking about gender dysphoria. They weren't thinking about transgenderism. And yet you're going to have to address those and many other issues that never have been issues that pastors have ever had to address before.
It's a very different playing field nowadays in ministry.
Yes.
As anybody who's in ministry could tell you. And so we do need to kind of regroup our efforts on how to do better preparation for that.
So again, if you are interested in the book, there are whole sections on male and female. Who thought that gender would be an issue that we'd have to address? Of course, adolescent sexuality. I've been on the board of various groups that have really tried to warn young people about the dangers of being sexually involved, and that's changed dramatically. I mean, when I was growing up in Berkeley, California, yes, there were STDs. There were 2 of them, both of which were curable. Now there's more than 30,
yes,
many of which are lethal.
That's
and
right.
So the dangers are ever greater than they were before. Then you have whole sections here about like reproduction, contraception, infertility. Dr. Glahn, of course, has been quite an expert on that.
Yes.
Whoever had to think about genetic engineering, artificial insemination, artificial reproduction, test tube babies, and all of that. Then a whole section on cohabitation. Scott Sandley, who you and I were talking about before we got into that. In just a minute, I want to talk about your chapter on divorce, which, again, I've noticed that that changed years ago when John Reed had me teach at Dallas Seminary. I was noticing a change in the pronoun. They would sometimes, when we talk about divorce, say, what do we do about those people, meaning those people outside the church, with the issue of divorce? And then pretty soon, how are we going to do with our issue of divorce? Because the divorce came inside the church, and that changed dramatically. Pornography used to be that you'd have to go to a seedy section of town to see that. Now it's just a mouse click away. And then, of course, same-sex attraction, sexual orientation, gender dysphoria, all the rest. I love how you start your introduction here. Most people probably don't know the names Obergefell and Hodge, but if you know anything about the Supreme Court decision on same-sex marriage, that is the case. So we're going to get into just 1 or 2 of the chapters, but since we have Dr. Gary Barnes writing the chapter on divorce, a research-based perspective, we're going to talk about some of the myths about divorce and how to address those issues. Of course, there's a theological issue that I know also is part of the book, and so we'll get into some of that. And then before we're done, we'll get into your chapter on personal and interpersonal sexual ethics. So we have a lot to cover, and along the way, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
If you've ever read George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984, you are familiar with the idea of newspeak. Examples would be war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. But if you look at the news media today, you would probably conclude that Orwell accurately predicted the future, but was just off by about 36 years. Gerald Baker believes that the news media has become fluent in newspeak. He acknowledges that we don't have a ministry of truth here in America, but that doesn't mean that newspeak isn't alive and well in the news coverage we receive. Consider the term freedom. Yes, we're told that free speech does exist on college campuses, but it is so narrowly defined as to not really be free speech at all. He refers to a letter circulated at Princeton University requiring all research and publications be submitted for approval to a special committee in order to root out anything that might be considered a racist thought. How about the term violence? According to most of the mainstream media, smashing a statue or assaulting a police officer does not constitute violence if done by a progressive protester. One example he supplies is a BBC tweet that actually said 27 police officers injured during largely peaceful anti-racism protest. By contrast, we have the example of Senator Tom Cotton, who wrote an op-ed for the New York Times that suggested that U.S. military could be used when violent protests have overwhelmed police and the National Guard. Staff at the New York Times were furious that his op-ed was printed and argued that his writing was actually a form of violence that must be prohibited from the newspaper. We live in a world where words like freedom, violence, and racism have been redefined, so be on the lookout for newspeak. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Gary Barnes. And again, the book, which is entitled Sanctified Sexuality, is coming out in this September, but we are covering some of it now as kind of an advance, but also just a resource that I think would be very helpful. And Dr. Gary Barnes, you have a chapter 16 on divorce, a research-based perspective. For people that maybe later want to talk about the biblical text, well, Hall Harris has written that chapter, which is helpful too. And I know when I've spoken sometimes at doctor of ministry classes in various seminaries, they want to focus some of the time on the biblical text. But then finally I say, let's move off to that and really answer the question, do any of you have divorced couples in your church? Well, yes, all of them do. Now what do you do? And so in some respects, we'll look first at the myths. You have the 10 myths about the whole issue of divorce. And so that gets us into some of the facts and figures. Then we're going to talk about, are there some things that we can learn in terms of people that have studied, individuals that in one way or another maybe had poor communication skills. And that's some of the predictive research. And then you've got some material on outcomes as well.
Right.
But let's get into some of the myths. I guess I could work way through a few. But before we get into that, a lot of that comes from the National Marriage Project.
Yes.
And that's David Popenoe and Barbara Defoe Whitehead's have been on the program with us before.
Oh, no kidding.
She's actually been, matter of fact, she was in studio. That's 2 studios ago, so that goes back a while. But the Marriage Project was really a helpful way of looking at myths about cohabitation and about marriage, weren't they?
Yes, yes. And even before we get to these list of 10 that they are primarily responsible for pulling all of the data together for,
yes.
I might even add an 11th just to start with, and that's the myth that being a good Christian prevents you from having divorce.
Yeah.
And so I actually got very interested in divorce because of the family of origin that I grew up in as a Southern Baptist preacher's kid. Came home from camp one summer and found out my parents were getting divorced. Never saw them fight once in my whole life.
Isn't that amazing?
See? And so there really wasn't a question of what the Bible says about divorce. I think we were all pretty clear on that, even me included. But there had to be something else that went into understanding how does this happen?
Yes.
How does this really happen? And is there some other pathway that could happen?
Yes.
And so this research chapter we felt was very, very important for adding and complementing what the Bible is already telling us.
That's one of the reasons why I wanted to promote this, because I would have to say that any individual that finds themselves in any kind of spiritual authority, whether they're the pastor or Bible fellowship leader, small group leader, this is the kind of book you definitely want to have on your shelf, because you'll be finding yourself pulling it out. And I've seen this over the years, too, when you cover some of these issues. Seminary students, you probably would agree with that. Oftentimes, they're just looking for information. Then if you go and teach in a doctoral ministry class, the people that are now in the ministry, they're looking for ammunition, because they recognize that I sort of only paid attention to this issue of divorce. Now I've got couples in my church that are saying, why shouldn't we get divorced? Or do you have a hope that we can avoid a divorce? And since I'm the old guy around the table, I can remember a time when divorce was relatively difficult, and now we have no-fault divorce. If one couple wants to get divorced, it's almost impossible to pull together. If just one partner wants to get divorced, you can get divorced for any reason or no reason at all, can't you?
Yes, and 1969, California led the way with that. And, it was another one of those initial good intention things that, especially in domestic violence situations, women would no longer be trapped.
Yes.
And that was a big, big problem.
Yes.
And so... and it was not too long before state after state after state moved to that same. We didn't see at the time the downside possibilities that would go with no-fault divorce.
Yes. And so in some respects, we've learned our lesson the hard way.
Yes.
And we've seen the divorce rate has gone up rather significantly. And what I found was so interesting when I look at some of the divorce statistics, they weren't necessarily couples after many years finally deciding to throw in the towel after the kids went off to college, but sometimes within a few years they got divorced, because it has to, and we'll get to this in just a minute, to some of the research done by John Gottman and Scott Stanley and others. They had poor communication skills going in, right?
That was a very big finding. And that's a thing that really helps us connect with the myths. Most people, especially anybody in ministry who's done premarital counseling, you would say from your experience that most people who say, hey, let's spend the rest of our lives together, they have good goals behind that statement. Right. They have good intentions, like we're going to have a relationship of stability and satisfaction. That's what we're in for.
Right.
Almost across the board, I'm hearing that from everyone. And yet, when you really look at the outcomes for the full length of the relationship, we're seeing only 20 to 30% of the people who start off with that goal that actually would be characterized by a relationship of stability and satisfaction.
And it's really a sad commentary. What about a couple of the myths? One that I've talked about on this program, and I know you would want to address: living together before marriage is a good way to reduce the chances of eventually divorcing. Actually, now the research goes just the other direction, doesn't it?
That's right. And, Scott Stanley, a mentor of mine and a really great friend, I would consider the leading expert and researcher in this area. And so we're very fortunate to have him contribute a whole chapter just on cohabitation.
That's right.
There's a little overlap for us here. And this is just another one of those things that we would say can have a good intention behind it, but has a negative impact if you look at the overall average outcomes of this.
And again, tends to increase it. Another one which came, and it's interesting that some of the researchers aren't exactly evangelical Christians. Judith Wallerstein, of course, we've had Diane Medved on a couple of times as well, all have found that the original thought was, well, divorce might be kind of an acute problem for the kids, but eventually they would get over it. And the reality is it's long-lasting. Now we talk about adult children of divorce, but many of these people that are coming to these conclusions about marriage and divorce aren't exactly the people that would sign the doctrinal statement of Dallas Theological Seminary.
That's right.
But they're the kind of people that are really basically saying, you know what the Bible had to say was really true all along.
And like Judith's a great example. She followed children of divorce for decades.
Yeah, longitudinal study.
And wrote a book, Legacy of Divorce. And so she's talking about continued negative effects. Even in adults who are in stable and happy marriages continue to be driven by anxiety about whether they can sustain that or not.
What about the long-term impacts? Because we were just sort of alluding to that. I always say, you know, some of them are economic, one of the E's. Some of them are educational. And another one is emotional. So, you know, my 3 E's of the impact of divorce seem to be pretty significant. And you have one of the myths here talking about, you know, whether a woman's standard of living goes up or goes down, whether a man's does as well. In some respects, divorce is really devastating, and there's a good reason, just even apart from the emotional issues, to talk about the economic issues and the impact that it's going to have on your children.
Yes, it's costly all around. Financially, emotionally, long-term coping strategies that get developed. So, mental health outcomes. What we're not saying, I do want to kind of be clear to give my disclaimer up front. And I think it is not only from research, but biblically speaking, we're not saying that there never should be a divorce. I think that's a really important statement to make.
Because you have some people that are in abusive situations and threatening and all those kinds of things. So certainly that is the case. So let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into a few more because, you know, one of the arguments, and you take this on as myth number 6, when parents don't get along, children are better off of the parents' divorce than if they stay together. And that has been kind of an interesting set of studies that have been done. Also, if a child grows up in a broken home by divorce, that in some respects might have a better chance, but we'll talk about some of that. But most importantly, we also have all this research by John Gottman and Scott Stanley and others that said when we watch how individuals interact on a situation, we can, with a high degree of predictability, say whether or not this will end in divorce or not. And so that's something I want to pass on to pastors and marriage counselors and just individuals that maybe want to try to evaluate what their kids are about ready to get into. So we're going to get into some of those issues with Dr. Gary Barnes, but we need to take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
"2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue conversation in studio with Dr. Gary Barnes. And let me just mention he is the general editor, along with Dr. Sandra Glahn, of the Sanctified Sexuality book, Valuing Sex in an Oversexed World. It is published by Kriegel, coming out this fall. And we are covering it now because over the next couple of weeks, I would love to do some interviews with some of the individuals, 23 different chapters, and just some great material. At the moment, looking at chapter 16, seen on divorce. One of those was the myth: when parents don't get along, children are better off if the parents divorce than if they stay together. Why is that a myth?
Well, I guess our best answer to that is it depends.
Yeah.
And so the big predictor is not divorce in and of itself for outcomes of children, but it's all of the things that naturally go with divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And so the two biggest things that impact kids that naturally follow divorce is conflict does not get better. It gets worse after a divorce.
Yes.
And then the other is that children are not supported in having a relationship with each parent.
Mm-hmm.
And so that tends to get worse after the divorce.
Pretty amazing. One of the other ones I know that you want to oftentimes talk about is being very unhappy at certain points in a marriage is a good sign that the marriage will eventually end in divorce. So why prolong unhappiness? And you quote from Linda Waite, the University of Chicago sociologist, and others to just point out that that is a myth that a lot of people unfortunately buy into, because every day, Dr. Gary Barnes, we have people go into the divorce courts because they've given up on solving a problem that other couples choose because of a covenant agreement to work their way through, right?
Yes, and it's such an interesting study. I love this because what they did was they actually did direct observation of couples who were right at the point, all of them, a large group, saying, I'm ready to divorce. And then as they continued to follow these couples over a 5-year time period,
yes,
right at the beginning of the 5 years, this big group formed two separate groups. And one group chose to get divorced, and the other group chose not to get divorced.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're following these two subgroups for 5 years. 5 years later, most of the people who chose not to get divorced reported not only being glad that they didn't get divorced, but that they were actually happy in their marriages 5 years later. And most of the people who chose to get divorced at that time when things were so bad said 5 years later, my life is not better.
Yeah, and sometimes regretted that decision.
Yes.
Which kind of gets us to the next point, and that is what you call the predictive research. And years ago we talked about it, but we haven't talked about this in years. But I think this would be a surprise to a lot of our listeners that by watching these particular couples before they get married and see how they resolve potential conflict, sometimes you have escalation, sometimes you have areas of contempt, sometimes you have withdrawal, but you could predict with almost 90% accuracy which ones are going to be successful and which ones are going to fail. Talk about that.
Isn't this interesting? So, you know, after the no-fault divorce was taken its effect 2 decades later, you know, the cost of this was just rippling, not only for individuals and families, but communities and nationally. And researchers are saying, man, there's got to be something we can learn about this to reduce the cost. And a lot of grant money was provided for researchers to do way more than just survey research. This was longitudinal empirical studies where they're following the same couples over long periods of time with direct observation. And some of the couples have been followed for over 2 decades.
Right.
Okay. So John and Julie Gottman, Scott Stanley, Howard Markman, David Olson, many research centers in different places of the country were doing the same kind of study. And so they would get couples at the premarital stage who said, we're going to spend the rest of our lives together. They would collect all the data they could from them that might be a possible predictor, put it in the data bank, and then have them come back, many of them on an annual basis, to see how you doing now. And they're looking specifically at stability and satisfaction.
Right.
And so it was kind of surprising that after even a short time, like a 3-year time period, you get the emergence of three groups: people who don't stay together, people who stay together but they're not glad they're staying together, and then people who stay together and are mostly glad they're staying together. And so these became, that was kind of the no-brainer, seeing the emergence of these three groups. The key was to go back to the pre-existing data bank and see, are there variables that uniquely match up with one group that don't match up with the other two groups? And especially that third group, the together and mostly glad we're together group, they had very clear findings about predictive variables that sets them apart from the other two groups. Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't what most people thought. Like, if you just find the right person, you'll get the right outcome. Or if you can just manage your external circumstances, you can get the right outcome. See? And so those things had zero predictability.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
So the short way of explaining, you might say, well, what is the predictor? So the short way of explaining it is, it's not so much about having the right circumstances or finding the right partner, but it is about being the right partner.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a specific way to be the right partner, and that's your interactional choices with one another on a day-to-day basis. So we don't just fall out of love the way we fall out of trees. What we do is we erode it away, one small choice after another.
Yeah, it's just that drip, drip, drip. And sometimes it's negative interpretation. Sometimes it's withdrawal and avoidance. Sometimes it's escalation. It starts out with you didn't put the cap on the toothpaste, and pretty soon it's, DEFCON 5 or whatever, 4, 3, 2, 1, And so you just, in some respects, begin to see that. And they were watching these videos and sometimes could pick out a problem even before they go to the altar to make that decision about getting married.
Yes,
Yeah.
They would actually, through 1 hour of videotape with interaction choices and graduate student slave labor, 24 hours of microcoding, they could predict anywhere between 85 and 94% accuracy which couples are going to be divorced.
That is amazing. One other thing in your chapter here is about outcome research, because that's something as well, which I think relates to just what we were just talking about, because in some respects, you can follow it out and really see where it ends up, can't you?
Yes. And so you have the outcome of whether you're going to be in groups 1, 2, or 3, not together, together, and not glad you're together, or together and mostly glad you're together. So there is that outcome. But there's also outcome studies that have taken the findings from the predictive research, and they say, could we give information and skills to couples that would change the direction of their outcome?
Yes.
And so this is really fascinating findings. So if you took information and skills, packaged it into a 12-hour workshop, it may be one weekend, or it sometimes was 2 hours a week for 6 weeks, okay? And you do random assignment to 3 different groups. Control groups get nothing. A naturally occurring, and this is commonly like church groups who are big on information and inspiration, okay? And then you do a third group that is the treatment group based on research. So they're like smart bomb targeting interventions of information and skills for couples based on the research findings. You follow those couples in all 3 of those groups for the next 5 years, and you look at their outcomes. And so 5-year studies are hard to do because people disappear. It's hard to follow up on them.
I'm sure.
But Scott Stanley and Howard Markman, for instance, have like 10 different outcome studies that show a 12-hour workshop training that's research-based reduces divorce rates less than half of those who don't have that.
Amazing. So again, just some great material that is in this chapter, and it's just one of the chapters, chapter 16. But I thought after we come back from the break, you have a section here on personal and interpersonal sexual ethics.
Yes.
And I love this because I love this little diagram. Sacred sexuality, it can go in one direction of deifying sex, the other direction of demonizing sex, and we want to be biblically based, and so we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and we are privileged to have in studio with us for a few more minutes Dr. Gary Barnes, and he is one of the co-editors of the book Sanctified Sexuality, Valuing Sex in an Oversexed World. It's published by Kriegel. You'll see it this fall, but we're talking about some of this ahead of time so that you know the book is coming out and so that you can benefit. And Dr. Gary Barnes, your last chapter here is on personal and interpersonal sexual ethics. And for people looking online here, I love your little diagram because it's this idea of sanctified sexuality, and it's almost like if you will, a circle. You can go one direction where we demonize sex. We've certainly seen that. The other one where we deify sex, and it really kind of brings us back to the subtitle of the book, Valuing Sex in an Oversexed Society or World. There are so many misconceptions and myths, even inside the church, right?
Oh, for sure. I like to refer to that as the slippery slope of sexuality. And in many ways, I could see how the church is more vulnerable to the slippery slope of sliding in either direction or even both directions. Mm-hmm. And so, we are maybe missing God's idea of sexuality as a way of avoiding the potential dangers of sexuality. And so we tend to demonize or repress our experience with sexuality. But we are, by God's design, sexual beings. And so you're actually going against God's design by doing that.
And again, I know that some pastors, if they were going to talk about human sexuality, but they're get a little bit nervous and start sweating and don't know what to say. And yet, if you aren't speaking into the lives of just take the adolescent boys, if nothing else, who have by now found pornography and really have very bizarre ideas about human sexuality, you really need to take them back to some of the principles. And the first one is, of course, creation and the fall. I mean, we have to recognize that God intended for us as sexual beings in a perfect garden with sinless individuals. But now we live in a fallen world with sinful individuals. So how do we kind of make our way through all of that?
So that's what makes it a slippery slope. It's so hard to get back to that elevated place of sanctified sexuality. And, whenever I'm bumping into working with people where there's sexual acting out, there's pornography, there's affairs, any of those problem areas, what's so common is you can see how sex became an attempt to meet non-sexual needs sexually. And that's where we deify sex. We try to make sex to do something that sex was not designed to do. And that's a real common struggle that this side of the fall that we're all vulnerable to fall into. It's a idol worship. It's having something to do something it wasn't meant to do.
And it kind of gets back to your experience. You come back from summer camp, and all of a sudden you thought two people that you know would never get divorced are now getting divorced. It is a situation that anybody listening can relate to. I did not expect that these pastors, or the pastor and his secretary, the pastor and the choir director, were going to have this affair.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's a sense in which oftentimes it isn't about the sex. It's really about the relationship. It's about the whole and the heart. It's about the need, isn't it?
It's exactly what makes us vulnerable for that deifying side of the slippery slope. Yes.
So again, this is the slippery slope of the idea of sacred sexuality, and it's one of the chapters there. But I thought just in the few minutes I have remaining, let's kind of talk about how people can use this book, because it's coming out. And as I said, 23 different chapters, a number of very important principles which we need to address, because we live in a world that is oftentimes getting just all sorts of contrary views about human sexuality. And if we assume that people are going to sort all of that out with a 20-minute or 40-minute sermon from a pastor who may not even address those issues, they're going to be hearing the voices from the world. And back to the reason you did this, you felt that even some people who are well-meaning Christians have done some things and said some things that haven't been helpful.
Yes, and that kind of ties back in at the very last chapter at the end, the interpersonal ethic. That I'd like to give a word on that. You know, a good friend of mine, Kurt Neal's a filmmaker, and so we actually did a documentary, 90-minute documentary that we named Compelling Love. And so I really like that as the interpersonal ethic. And we were picking up on a question that Tim Keller asked in one of his sermons one day, and that is, how do you respond to a person who significantly differs from you or distresses you with their beliefs or behaviors? See? And the compelling love ethic is taken from Romans 15:7. And that says, receive others as you have been received by Christ. How did Christ receive me? When I was at odds, when I was in opposition, when I was adversarial to Christ, he moved towards me at his expense. And that's how we're to respond to others. Receive others as you have been received by Christ. It doesn't mean that you're compromising on your beliefs or what you hold to be authoritative truths. It doesn't make truth relative. But what it says is, be like Jesus, be full of grace and truth. And how do you give the message of moving towards someone even when they're at odds with your beliefs?
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of the argument that we give around here about civility. You know, really, civility is based upon the golden rule. Treat other people as you'd like to be treated. Because it used to be, we say, well, be tolerant, but the word tolerant has been completely redefined, as you will know. And as a matter of fact, there's some great sections in this book about how tolerance is now applied to homosexuality, transgenderism, all those kinds of things. So civility is the word I like to use because in some respects we are to move in that direction. We are to be gracious. And we are to speak truth and love. And so we don't compromise truth. We don't compromise love. And what we sometimes see is sometimes the liberal churches are all big about love, but not so much on truth.
It's a hard balance,
The fundamentals have always been good about truth, but not so much about love. And we need to have both of those. So I think that's just another issue of diversity that you address in that chapter as well. Well, as you can already imagine, we have a lot more to cover than we have time to do so. So I'm looking forward to some of your other colleagues and some of your co-authors joining this conversation as well, because this book will be coming out in the fall. Maybe we can even hasten its arrival as quickly as possible. But I wanted you to know about that. And if you find yourself saying, I want to get a copy of the book, or at least I'd like to pre-order it, go to the website. We've got a picture there of Gary Barnes. Click on the button that says See More. Click on the book itself, and there is an opportunity for you to order it either in paperback or Kindle. 23 chapters, just a who's who of individuals that you've been able to attract to address these controversial issues that we talk about so often here on Point of View. So, Dr. Gary Barnes, thank you so much for being in here.
Thank you so much, Kirby.
Say hi to Sandra Glahn, Dr. Glahn, and I'm see if we can get you in again. I'm thinking maybe we could do a roundtable sometime with maybe 2 or 3 people and then take questions from the audience as we get closer to the book. But that's all we have for today. I want to thank Andrew for his help behind the scenes, engineering the program, as well as Ivy for producing it as well. And we have our Friday weekend edition tomorrow, so we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.